with all of that, I actually will turn things over to Dr. Stambough to take us away, give us our rules of engagement and a little educational piece.
Right, thank you. And thanks for organizing all of this for everybody who's put the work in over the year to put together a long series of these. And it's important. I do remember when we didn't really have these at the 2016 election. And as I mentioned at a few forums, that my class met Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So Wednesday after Election Day, I go into a section of one of the large sections of Introduction to American Government, which is not it's a political science class, but it's really not for majors as much. So people from all around campus, about 200 students, and I had about 2/3 who were in shock and almost in tears, and about 1/3 who were celebrating, and we had to have a class. So, with very different emotions that were very high. That's a difficult thing to do. So I'm glad that we're doing this a little bit more intentionally around campus. So thank you for putting all of that together. Uh, Let me go through a few things in terms of election process, election results, and then go into kind of the civic engagement aspect of it. And um, just to give a little bit of a background, which will have some relevance a little bit later about all of this, including the civic engagement part. I'll tell you a little bit about kind of tiny bit about my background and why I kind of got interested and where I come from with all this. So for whatever reason, I've been politically interested since I was a kid, little kid. So the very first campaign I volunteered on, I was 7. Uh, yeah. And just kind of got hooked after that and went into it as a career. And either was going to go into campaign work or into academia. And I dabbled in a little bit of both and settled on this because it's got much better hours. Campaign work, I cannot imagine how much sleep they don't get because I did a little bit of that for a while. But with my background, my parents came from very different cultural backgrounds. So I had a mom who kind of described politically as uh, first generation Italian American out of New England, definitely an FDR New Deal Democrat, who out of high school joined the military, where she met my dad, who was a old school Midwestern small town Republican, also military, both very Catholic. Uh, and they married all their lives, all that type of stuff. One was Democrat, one was Republican, and so I grew up with civil dialogues. I grew up with competing viewpoints being respectfully and sometimes playfully discussed. I'm used to that. That's kind of what I was raised on. I always think back to one time when I was in high school. I heard them talk around the dinner table. It's like, look, we're both busy. Election day is Tuesday. You're going to cancel my vote. I'm going to cancel your vote. Why don't we just agree not to vote? And then they did that, but they both ran into each other at the voting booth at lunch break from where they were working, and they just started laughing about it. So they were both, which was just perfect. Also, one of the things from back then, so we're talking about like the 80s around there, we had bigger swings in our elections. So you go from, you think of it, you go from Carter beating Ford to Reagan having a pretty sizable victory over Carter, to Reagan having a massive victory over Mondale, to then Bush with a smaller one. So there's a big swing in there. And then Clinton comes in. We had this kind of conversation around the country where it seems like a much larger percentage of the population were willing to change their minds. Were willing to listen to opposing viewpoints, listen to the other party, and evaluate things the way they were in the country. And I was thinking about that when looking at just the election results and putting them into more recent historical perspectives. So if you think back we'll just do the last 4. So we've got Barack Obama, John McCain running in 2008. And it's in the middle of just a massive economic crisis at the time. Okay. The Democratic candidate gets about 53% of the vote. Republican candidate gets about 45, and then there's and change. So it's around that kind of spread, which is a pretty big victory. It kind of retreats back to what seems to be a mean the 4 years later. So you don't have the economic crisis. You don't have kind of that aspect of it. You don't have the kind of new, young, charismatic, fresh face of a brand new candidacy for Obama. And you go into 2012, and it's a little bit closer election. It's basically, when you look at the national vote, 51-47. That's pretty much what we had last week. It's 51-47. And even if you go to 2016, we had two candidates who were polarizing and were not popular with a number of people, with both Trump and Hillary Clinton. And you had some visible, not viable, but visible third-party candidates who seemed to be an outlet for protest votes, for disaffected Democrats who maybe they supported Bernie Sanders and they couldn't quite pull the Hillary Clinton one, or they might have been for Ted Cruz and couldn't quite pull the Donald Trump one. But you basically had a 3-point national victory for the Democrats in the popular vote, but not the electoral college vote, which we'll go into the process part in a little bit. What strikes me about all that is how stable it is. So over 16 years, we fluctuated by a percentage point or two either way in the presidential vote. And that when you take a look, when all the dust is settled from this one, this is effectively, with some differences in a few states, but nationally, it's effectively what it was in 2012. So for all the stuff that's happened, it's been, whether you love Trump or hate Trump or somewhere in between, it's been a really active, exciting, frustrating, whatever. Put in whatever word you want to put in there, because it's all up to you on that point. 4 years with an incredible year that we just went through, with economic crises, with pandemics, with responses to that, some responses good, some responses bad, all of that. At the end of it, it just didn't move the electorate. And what that tells me, to some degree, is that we are at a point in society where everybody has chosen a team and they're not listening to the other side, which is why these things, I think, are that much more important. Things of civil dialogue where people, regardless of their political positions, will engage in a conversation. And we know that it's harder to do that. We know it's harder to do that for society. Anybody with any social media knows the algorithm will show you what you want to see. And anybody who goes on the web will know the algorithm will reinforce your beliefs. And with all the different media environments that are out there, that polarizes a lot of stuff to the point where it's about outcome. So it's about political preferences and how people vote. And this time it also became about the election process itself. And that had a big impact. And that goes into the bullet point about election process. As a political scientist, I found it fascinating and amazing that for the first time probably since 2000, since the recount of Florida, and we're all only focused on Florida, and this time we're focused more. We had people really paying attention to how our elections are conducted and what that means. And one of the things we know, and we've always known, but as people who pay attention to it have always known, is that it's a really, really decentralized system. So it's not even just 50 states plus the District of Columbia conducting elections all on the same day. So we don't have one national election. We have 51 with DC, separate elections that are held simultaneously. But the administration of that sometimes is even very different down to the county level. So depending upon the state, they give more or less leeway to the counties about how to actually implement the election, how to design the ballots, what types of machines they're going to use. In Orange County, we have what is viewed nationally as one of the best, actually. Neil Kelly and our Orange County Registrar of Voters is viewed as, our county election administration is viewed as one of the best in the country, which is great. Got some national press for it this last year as well. There are other places where very simple decisions on election process can have a big impact. So for those of you who remember, we'll use 2000 before going into 2020. 2000 with the close election in Florida, there was a lot that was made about the design of the ballot in one county in Florida because the lines didn't quite line up. So maybe some people who thought they were voting for Gore actually pushed the button for Pat Buchanan instead, just because of the design of the ballot. Ballot design matters. That's the most high profile one that made the news 20 years ago. But ballot design has always mattered. There were And there've been long fights about how ballots are designed. Should they be electronic? Should there be a paper trail so that we can physically see this, or are we going to trust it just through electronic uh, calculation of the votes with no paper trail given? So should you have a paper ballot? Should it be absentee? I was thinking about this and it dawned on me, like I would tell my class, I voted absentee since we moved back to California in 2003, since my wife and I did. But it was before that. The first time I voted absentee was 1986, which was the first time I ever voted. So you can do the math and figure out how old I was at that point. Um, so I was going to college in Kansas. We were living in Oklahoma. So I got an absentee ballot from Oklahoma. And there weren't a lot of percentage of people doing absentee ballots then. And for the different parts of the election, I got different sheets of paper, and not like what we would view as formal sheets of paper. One of them was almost like a grade school check, if you like me, check yes type of thing. I mean, it was almost to that level. And I had to take all those different slips of paper it was a Catholic school, so I had a nun notarize it, which I guess is an extra level of security for election process, and send it back. And that's a long time ago, but it was a much smaller percentage. And then recently, you've seen in some states an expansion before the pandemic of absentee votes. So Oregon, quite a while ago, changed the law so that um, everybody got a mail-in ballot. So their entire election has been mail-in for several election cycles now. One of the interesting parts for me as just a social scientist is there were a number of studies right away which took a look at an interesting outcome because of that. And it was that there was identifiable portions of Oregon's Latino community that had a lower than expected voter turnout rate when they shifted to mail-in ballots. And what they found is that they were able to fix this down the road, but it was identifying a problem. And with kind of the political sociologists going into communities and interviewing and trying to figure out what was going on, there is a percentage of the population which wasn't solely Latino, but it overlapped a lot with the Latino population within Oregon that didn't trust the mail, that would, for anything important. So it would go down to the city office to pay bills, go down to the water district to pay bills, and do it in person, and would not put it in the mail. And they did not want to put their ballot in the mail because they didn't trust it. So that change, which was designed to expand the franchise to everybody or try to increase voter turnout, it did, but then it also, without their knowing, kind of disenfranchised for a little while until there was on the ground campaign work within the communities to increase confidence in it. So now it doesn't work that way, but it did for the first election cycle or two. That's what seemed like a very simple change with a predictable outcome. Voter turnout was going to go up if we make it easier for people to vote. That didn't impact everybody equally and actually had a negative impact on one particular community. So when we look at election rules, we know they matter. There's not one way to count the votes. There's not one way to pick the winner. There are a lot of different ways. So the rules really do matter. When we come up to 2020 with the election process, the biggest story that kind of played out over the last few days, and we know that election day is not election day is election season, I'm just going to put it that way, was in a number of states, not all of them, Arizona's a little bit different, but in a number of states that really seemed to matter, the last couple, Pennsylvania being the big one, there was what was viewed and talked about as being a red mirage. And what the red mirage was when you counted the first votes that were going to come in, it was going to look like it was more Republican. And then as more votes came in, it was going to skew more Democratic. And if it was enough to move it over the edge with the Democrats, which is what it seems like it's happened. Why did that take place that way in Pennsylvania, but not in Florida? Or why did it take that place in Pennsylvania more so than it did in Wisconsin? Or why is it a little bit different in Arizona? And it was because of the way that the parties use absentee ballots, but also when we count them. So state law in Pennsylvania, which was different than state law in a lot of other states, absentee ballots that came in we could not begin processing them until election day. And by begin processing them, it's even matching up the signatures, verifying it actually is the person, that it's a legal ballot, doing all that work, which takes a lot of time. If you can do that before election day and not tabulate the votes, but do that part of it before election day, then those results can come in earlier in the day. By pushing that off until election day itself, it meant that those votes weren't going to be tabulated until later in the day. Because Democrats in Pennsylvania had more of a campaign of mail your ballot in, and Republicans had a campaign against that in Pennsylvania, the Republican votes got counted first, Democratic votes got counted last. That's because of state law. That's just because of the way if the law was written differently, it would have been in a different sequence. So the rules there matter both in terms of how easy or difficult it is for people to vote, and that can be different by jurisdiction. And then also what the results, how quickly the results are going to come in. So when I think about all that, I think of it in terms of, okay, we know the election results nationally, which is what people focus on. What does it actually tell us about local? Or what did Tuesday tell us about local? I think one thing it told us is for all the Democrat celebration from 2018, which they deserve to celebrate because Orange County turned Democratic for the first time like ever. There was a little bit of pushing back off of that, it seemed like in 2020. Some of the seats, we'll still count a few. Some of the seats, it looks like congressional seats that Democrats won barely in 2018, they might not hold on to in 2020, which tells me Orange County isn't blue, but it's not red like it was. It really is a swing county, especially some of the districts. So I think that might put some things in perspectives for one side, give some hope to the other side a little bit. California, since we are in California, wanted to focus on that a little bit. What did it tell us statewide? It told us with a lot of the propositions that we may be a predominantly Democratic partisan state, but on all issues, we're not a really liberal progressive state. So there were some of the issues that were brought to the ballot. The repeal of the ban on affirmative action for one, especially I think that one's one that I don't know if it surprised people, but it's one that I think makes this point, is that California isn't purely liberal, purely progressive. It leans that way, but it leans that way. Partisanship, it's pretty strong throughout the state with small pockets, but pretty strong throughout the state's Democratic. But that doesn't mean that every idea from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is going to get statewide support. The change of the tax code worked that way. The proposed change to affirmative action worked that way. And then we have one that goes across ideological lines in all kinds of strange ways, which are going to be fascinating, which is the one about gig economy and what that means. So the ones for Uber and Lyft. It means that money matters because Uber and Lyft and other gig economy people put in like $200 million to this campaign. But it also means that something that I don't think really followed along party lines very well. So it's a different issue that I think is interesting because it's one that I think we might be able to have more of a bipartisan civil dialogue on publicly, not just in Zoom meetings like this one, but publicly throughout the state, because it's not one that lines up along party lines very well. It was kind of my overview of it. The results are where we thought they were a couple days ago nationally. It looks like President-elect Biden, President Trump is going to try to do some things to the courts. I looked at least what I've seen so far. It doesn't seem like there's anything that would overturn anything. The margins are a little bit bigger in those states now than they were in 2016 in his favor. It's not a huge win in a lot of the states, but it's a sizable enough win that recounts tend not to have any impact whatsoever. Recounts tend to matter when you're talking about 100 votes or 200 votes or something like that, not when you're talking about 10,000, 20,000. So that's kind of the background off of this. And then moving into kind of what is the civil dialogue? Civil dialogue is a place where, the way I understand it, and feel free to jump in and correct me off of this, civilly, of course. It's a place where people of different viewpoints can sit together and talk about things that in other environments we might not have that opportunity to do. Yeah, I mentioned social media beforehand. There are so many bubbles, not just social media, but all throughout media. So many bubbles out there that people don't get out of. And then when they do, or they're faced with something off of that, it tends to blow up where it's not civil. Um, you know, I didn't even know this was going on. My wife and I happened to be driving by when the intersection of Yorba Linda and Imperial Highway, when a few weeks ago when there were protests over there that ended up getting a little bit violent. Um, so that's the non-civil dialogue. That was two different groups shouting at each other from across the street. Civil dialogue is where we try to find a common ground or we try to understand each other. And the only way that we can really do that is with the rules of engagement that we've established. So going through a few of those, one is the confidentiality, and that's where this part will not be recorded after this. And it's the understanding that whatever people say stays confidential. It's knowing that experiences aren't universal, so your experience is not experienced by other people. I think that's very, very clear throughout the country. Uh, Democrats need to understand rural voters a lot better, and Republicans need to understand urban voters a lot better if they want to make any grounds. If not, we're going to be stuck in this a couple of percentage point either way type of thing for a long time. Um, when we listen to understand and not just respond. And I think that's something that's good all throughout. It's something I wish would happen a little bit more at department meetings, but that's just me, and you can record that. That's totally fine. Um, it's okay just to listen and just to reflect on it a bit. When we ask questions, it's not to ask questions to criticize or to catch somebody in something. It's you ask questions with the intent of learning, and that means listening afterwards, listening to the answer, and that it's really okay to be uncomfortable, which is something that when I first started in the educational system, that was education. And maybe that was my Catholic college thing. It was no, we're going to make you uncomfortable. That's where you learn. You learn by you don't learn by being comfortable. You learn by being uncomfortable. It's when you learn stuff you didn't know otherwise. Uh, and and that was totally fine with me. And then use I statements. So it's really about what you believe and sharing what you believe, and then listening to what other people believe, and seeing if we can all learn from that. Anything that we need to add based on past examples off of this? We good? All right. Thanks. I will turn it back over to Bobby then.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Stambaugh. I just learned a lot in that moment. And thank you so much for covering those rules of engagement. Everyone understand Dr. Stambaugh has teed us up perfectly for our